Today is the last module of the online trainings that we have prepared. This last one will focus more on the pedagogies and just a recap a little bit of what we saw on the previous module. So in the first one, we explored how curriculum choices are shaped by dominant narratives and how resources can broaden or limit perspectives. We also examined the colonial axis through which content and materials might be presented in curricula, namely power, knowledge, being, nature, and gender. And during last module in groups, you reworked a lesson plan using the reflection framework to see how a decolonial practice can transform teaching. Then we'll start with a brainstorming exercise to discuss a little bit your pedagogical practices, because we acknowledge that you all have expertise teaching and you might already be using some relational and decolonial pedagogies in your practice. So this will be the first part of the training that will focus more on the pedagogies. And then after that, we'll move into the second part that will be given by my colleague Marta, that will join us a little bit later, and that will focus more on assessments. As we mentioned, this model is more focused on how teaching happens rather than what is taught, so it's more on the pedagogical aspect instead of the content. We want to focus on these pedagogical practices and syllabus design and assessment, and we want to invite you to reimagine your teaching as a relational, inclusive, and decolonial practice. So you will learn about relational pedagogy, dialogical classroom practices, and transformative approaches to assessment that disrupt hierarchical and colonial traditions of education. This model aims to equip you as educators with tools, methods, and reflective practices that are necessary to align your teaching with decolonial thinking. As I say, the emphasis is not on content, but on pedagogy and on how learning spaces are created, how relations in classroom are structured, and how assessment can be used. I would like to invite you all to do this little brainstorming session. So we'd love to hear from you. This is also the moment where you can share your experiences and how are you doing, how do you teach and what pedagogies do you use. So we prepare here some questions, but it's also an open invitation for you to rethink together and share what pedagogies do you use, what challenges may you be facing when using pedagogies. Maybe also the previous models have inspired you to think what can you do differently and how to implement what you've learned. Also regarding the pre-training material, if you've watched the videos, and so the materials, if you have any impressions, any questions, or maybe thinking about your own practice, you can already identify pedagogies that you're using that you might not realize before that they're more relational or decolonial. But by taking part of these trainings, you have been able to see that you do this maybe without calling it that. And if you have any concerns or like questions regarding the challenges or what can come with changing the nature of the pedagogies you use.
I use a mix in my lessons, a mix between collaborative teaching, inquiry-based learning, and student-centered pedagogy. I choose between it. It varies. Look after the subject, and then I choose which pedagogy fit the best.
That's great. And do you have any challenge, for example, when you're using a student-centered or with the students? Because I know it is not that common to use this type of pedagogical approaches. So it might be also students are not even prepared for that. So how do you also prepare your students for this?
I start small. First, I start my lesson with my information. I give my lesson, and then I start with one exercise where my students work together. And then I make the collaborative part bigger in my lessons after a month or two. The challenges I face are, I think, if you give students more autonomy, they speak a lot, the rumors, a lot of noise. That's what I face.
Thank you. Thank you. Is there anyone else that use similar approaches to teaching, or would like to share also challenges that they face with using maybe non-traditional teaching methods with students?
I just want to share what I tend to do when I enter the classroom. I tend to spend the first few minutes, 5 minutes, asking the students how they're doing. With one class in particular, we started a few years ago. They're now in the 5th year, but We started when they were very young to have a moment of meditation, and they keep on asking for it, even though we've got very little time to do it. We always have followed by conversation about current events, especially with the older students, whereas with the younger ones is asking them how they're feeling or if they have any tests that day, a bit of a chit chat to make them feel more comfortable. Teaching English as a foreign language, I tend to have an interactive lesson. So there's a lot of questions and answers and dialogues, or first and second year tends to be role play. And then when we go on, when they become a bit older and we discuss literary texts or current events, we try, because it doesn't always succeed, but we try to have a debate. And if there is a little time left, which happens very rarely because the 60-minute fly, I ask them for their feedback. So that's just what I wanted to share.
Thank you for sharing. For example, when you are doing the role playing and stuff like that, how do you prepare your students? Because I've also heard from teachers before that, for example, we're thinking of doing these activities where they're never too sure of how much do you share, or how do you prepare students so they really engage in these conversations.
I'm pretty lucky because the second language textbooks help us a lot. So we follow the directions of the textbook. But, you kind of illustrate what the topic is, what we want from them. Then we divide them into pairs or into groups, and then we go around the classes. Especially, we tend to do this during the hour a week the students spend with the teacher and the mother tongue teacher. So there's two of us going around the classroom and checking the pronunciation, making sure that they follow the instructions.
Thank you. As I mentioned, you're all already doing these more relational pedagogies, but maybe you didn't stop to think that they could be phrased or named like this. I also saw in the chat there was a comment that say discussion method, inquiry-based learning, problem-based learning, experiential learning. I don't know if you would like to also share how do you use these pedagogies and what challenges do you face with using them?
In our class, it's more easy to communicate the new lesson with my student. First of all, we try to discover which is their experience. For example, we talk about speed or about acceleration, how we can use the pedal of a car. And then we have an experiment. The experiment is on the lab. They try to do under the orders they have in small groups the experience to have some measures. They use the measures, they have results. We talk all together, not small groups, and we have new knowledge. We have a problem to solve. They use their experience from daily life, so it's easy to understand which is the new knowledge. Of course, we try to have a feedback not only for me, from our students, but also each group must have a feedback, how they work, how right is the result that they have. Also, we use this knowledge for the next lesson. We are going step by step.
Thank you for sharing. I think that also links to one of the elements that we wanted to discuss today, that is co-creation. Some of the other colleagues have mentioned engaging more the students and hearing and checking their knowledge and also getting this feedback. So that's very interesting.
Maybe it can
Yeah.
also a little bit exciting at first for a student to do some other non-traditional pedagogies. If they work with someone or in a group, it can be a challenge for the student to speak for a group or to share some information with a group. I can understand that it is a challenge if there isn't any trust in the group or communication possibilities. It's very important that you have clear expectations for your students and that you say it clearly to group.
I understand that making everyone feel safe and well in the group can take time, which is also not something that you have a lot of in school due to exam periods, curricular overload. So I know it can be very challenging to bring this more student-centered and other non-traditional pedagogies into a curriculum and a system that does not really allow for that time. I don't know if anyone else would like to also share.
I attended a course 2 years ago in France about meditation and breathing, just simple things like body scanning or just breathing. I do that when I enter the class and they are nervous or there is a little bit of chaos. And actually, they react very well. They calm down, and it's not lost time because maybe some other teachers could think that it's 5-10 minutes of lessons that goes away, but it's not because they are much more focused. I think it's a good practice, and I really like to improve from a methodological point of view. Also, I tended to do that with older students, but I tried this year with 14, 15 years old, and it works.
That's also very nice to hear. And I also saw
Yeah.
that you say that you use conversation on the latest news. And I know that can also be quite complicated and challenging considering the latest news of the world lately might not be so
Yeah.
positive. So how is your experience with that? And how did you also navigate these conversations that can turn into very challenging ones?
I try to find some documents, for example, I don't know, President Macron who talks about Palestine. We watch the video and I stop it. I try to help them if they don't understand everything because it's not easy to understand in the first years of French studying. And then we discuss, of course, we do it in Italian. And I try to understand their opinion, their point of view, try not to judge anything, but to listen to them and to say why they think so or on another way. And yeah, so 10 minutes. And also this thing, I do not always do that, but I think it's important to talk about what is happening around the world.
Yes, absolutely. Does any of you also engage or bring like latest history, like latest news into your teaching? And how do you navigate that?
I'm a pretty bad example at that part because I don't follow the news, but my students do. Sometimes they ask questions, and most of the time it goes like this. Oh, that's quite interesting. I didn't know that. When did that happen? Oh, yesterday, the day before yesterday. Okay, I found it quite interesting. I don't know nothing about. Let's say next lesson, tomorrow or the day after that, we will all together as a group at home search some things. I will look it up too, so I also know some stuff about it, and we will talk about it next lesson. That's how I do it, but I don't think it's how everybody does it because I think some people have more knowledge about the news than me.
No, but I think that's great, and that also shows how students are really engaged into these topics and they're really interested in these issues as well. I'm very glad to hear it is your student bringing the issues. I would expect it the other way around. You mentioned the peer tutoring activities, and I find that also very interesting. Could you explain a little bit more how you do these peer-to-peer activities?
I try to pair students at different levels, depends on the topic, of course. I just give them some exercise and I'm there only to look at what they're doing. So one student helps the other. And I realize that sometimes they understand better. We have actually an activity like this at a school level. So students that spend some time in the afternoon to help other students. It's a project of the school. And as a small activity, I do that in my class. So just giving them exercises, I'm thinking about grammar exercises, for example.
And I see a comment. You say you try MLTP. Can you explain what that is?
I just put the acronym. It's making learning and thinking visible. I'm sure you are all familiar with this method, which is pretty easy in reality. Once you learn how to do it, you want to make the thinking of your students visible. For example, stimulating their critical thinking. And this can be done with literature when dealing with literary texts mainly. So, for example, I guide my students to report what made them say what they said. My typical question would be something like, what made you say so? Give me evidence for this or that. Maybe we are analyzing or interpreting a text. And this sometimes leads to very unexpected places, because sometimes students really question their assumptions. Unexpectedly, they bring up a different perspective, and it creates a dialogue, a conversation, an exchange, an empathy with the students.
I'm not sure if everyone is familiar with these thinking routines, which is making your students understand better how they reach certain conclusions and certain arguments. Just to give a little bit more content to the brainstorming session that we just had, because our thinking was that you all are using different teaching methods and different strategies that can fit into this relational pedagogies approach, but it might be that you are not thinking of them like that yet. Maybe now, thanks to this training, you will start to see them. So we'll just introduce very briefly some key ideas. First, the topic of dialogical education is linked to the banking model of education from Freire. The name refers to the metaphor of students as containers into which educators must put knowledge. But Freire argued that this model reinforces a lack of critical thinking and knowledge over ownership in students, which in turn reinforces oppression, in contrast to what Freire proposes, which is focusing on the knowledge as a result of a human and a creative process. This changing on how we see education and moving away from the banking model of education also ask educators to move from teacher as the expert into teacher as the facilitator in the classroom. So there's a little bit of a shift for educators to take. By making this shift, you can embrace co-learning and co-creation pedagogies and methods. The approach draws from Freire's rejection of the banking model of education, emphasizing dialogical education, where learners and educators collectively explore themes and problems, which some of you are already doing, as you just mentioned and shared. The shift might challenge you as a teacher to adopt a more coaching approach, if you like, so encouraging students to explore and provide guidance where needed. You're setting a guiding framework and inviting them to explore what they want to learn and how they want to learn and what they will create with their peers. Of course, it means that you need to trust your students and their learning journey, and that your students can then help to determine what they want to learn, how they want to learn it, and what they want to create. So dialogical education is also about empowering your students to discover their own interests, strengths, and content that they are interested in. Then the other topic here that is very important is that learning is continuous. Learning does not only happen in the classroom, but students learn also outside of the classroom through their daily experiences. And as you mentioned, they might be checking the news and have a lot of questions, and they might come to you as their teachers. These relational pedagogies also emphasize teaching as a practice of freedom, rooted in experience, in mutual care, and lived knowledge. And they encourage the classroom to be a space for narrative, testimony, and embodied knowing, breaking hierarchical norms. Students can learn inside, but they also learn outside of the classroom. This also means that they bring their own backpacks, they bring their own ways of solving issues and solving problems that also has an impact of how they behave and learn in the classroom. Another important issue of these relational pedagogies is horizontal relationship building. So once you step down from the position of teacher as expert and you become like a co-creator with your students, there's more like the classroom becomes more than just a site for knowledge delivery and just for a lecture. It can be a space for co-creation where students and teachers collaboratively shape their learning experiences. Central to this approach is this idea of horizontal relationship building, where participants reflect on their own positionality, consider how their backgrounds influence assumptions, and critically engage with the knowledge that is being shared, but also what is not being shared and what is not being talked about. To build onto this horizontal relationship is the locus of enunciation framework developed by Andreotti. This can guide both educators and students in examining privilege, positionality within the colonial matrix, and the ways harm might inadvertently be reproduced. Then the last part about relational pedagogies is adaptive learning. So once you have created all this, it also allows you to understand better who your students are, what are your students bringing to the classroom, and that also allows you to enhance co-creation. So you're also better equipped with pedagogical strategies that help students participate in designing the lessons and shaping discussions and influencing classroom priorities. So this can be operationalized through different pedagogies. Some of you already mentioned them, so I will not give a very detailed explanation, but some are problem-posing learning, place-based learning, and project-based learning. Whether the starting point is a problem, a place, or a project, the underlying methodology is the same, that your students' life realities and agency shape the direction of the classroom. This allows activities to encourage adaptive and collaborative learning, rooting knowledge in experience rather than abstract universals. And all these methodologies help to come up with activities that encourage adaptive learning, because at the end you're adapting to who your students are and what are their needs. This also entails creating a learning environment where students can experiment and try out new things that they have never done before. And because they have never done them before, it might be that they're not so good at them at the beginning. So it's also a space where you need to let go of any perfectionisms and just let them build their own learning experience. Place-based learning starts with the place around students. So it might be that you can take your students to, for example, explore the cities that they lived in and try to relate what they're seeing to their classrooms. If you're doing a history lesson about 20th century, you can take a walk with your students and see if they can identify different symbols, the street names, monuments that might be physical representation of these histories in their local areas, and they can also connect better to the history and then connect better to the context by connecting to their lived experiences of where they are, because it might be places that they're very familiar with. Place-based learning revolves around space and places. Then there is project-based learning and problem-posing education. Project-based learning is where students are asked to develop a project, and this can also be done in very different subjects as well. So, for example, you can give them a project when you're in French classes that they need to develop a project about French culture. They need to think by themselves about what they want to do, how they're going to develop the project, what is going to be the end product, and so on. So you can give them some directions and guide them onto what they need to do at the end, or what do they need to do to get assessed by this activity. But at the end of the day, is the students themselves developing the project. And this also helps to enhance their critical thinking, but also empowers them and gives them more agency throughout the learning process. And then problem-posing education is emphasizing also the active creation of knowledge by students. It encourages students to generate their own questions and problems to explore rather than simply receiving information. So it also helps to develop their critical thinking, their creativity, and there you can also see an example. If you're looking at local environmental issues as part of a science class, students might have their own questions linked to what are the main causes of pollution in their community, how is climate change impacting their city or the country where they're living in. It also helps to locate more the knowledge for students, they relate to it more. And now I would like to give the floor to Marta, who will be in charge of the second part of this model that will focus more on assessment.
Thank you, Paula. I hope you had a constructive discussion about pedagogy. Now is turning into assessment. It can be interesting to reflect also what it could mean through a decolonizing lens. Most of the teachers need to follow some traditional assessment forced by the system, but many teachers also mentioned that a way to transform assessment is by doing some informal assessment, which is possible, for example, to assess more the process and less the final task, or just keep what is mandatory as a final exam, but during the year do group works, personal projects in which the students are tested informally, not in a way that feels stressful for them. Also, there was the problems of the family, because the families are quite involved in the education system and they want to know and they want to understand. So sometimes it's a bit challenging to propose some different types of assessment. Also, the struggle about objective and subjective assessment and how to measure this.
We also mentioned a lot of formal assessment that is given by the school system and that you have to adhere to, and that it can be really hard to really diversify your assessment in that way. However, we also talked about some strategies on how to do that, and I found it very interesting. One point that was raised was that as a part of formative assessment, there were some questionnaires sent out that focus on the specific needs of students and what they need for the next lesson. Another challenge is also to encourage the students and to have them believe in themselves and actually participate. You have to find the balance somehow, but there's a lot of difficulty.
This part is about deconstructing assessment. Assessment is what we decide counts as a learning, and decolonizing assessments means questioning what knowledge, values, voices define success. And it calls for approaches that they recognize diverse ways of knowing, doing, and being. I would like to briefly introduce 4 possible ways of thinking about assessment that moves beyond grading as a transaction, but of course they are just possible ways, and there are many more that you can explore. These perspectives invite us to see assessment as something relational, expressive, authentic, and collaborative as part of the learning and not just at the end of it. So the first shift is about seeing assessment as part of the relationship between the teacher and the student. So instead of treating a grade as a final verdict, it becomes a conversation more about growth built on care, respect, and mutual accountability. For example, an exam or after an exam or a final project, a student might meet with a teacher to reflect on what they have learned, what challenged them, and how they would approach things differently in the future. So it's a small shift, but it changes the tone of assessment, making it less stressful, moving from judgment to more recognition. The second idea focuses on diversity of expression, which we already encounter a bit in the content part of the last module. So traditionally, we often ask every students to show their learnings in the same way, usually through exams or essays. Students bring different strengths, different experiences, and ways of communicating. So what if we allow multiple ways of demonstrating learning, also through written works, presentation, or podcasts, or visual artifacts, group works, creative projects that are all guided by some shared criteria, of course. This flexibility can open space for some students' identities and voices to emerge. In some of the previous session, many teachers mentioned the fact that a lot of their students don't feel connected to the content, to what interests them, and the content seems disconnected from real life or lacking purpose for their life. It focuses more on authenticity, designing assessment that connecting learning both to the real world, but also to students' personal lives, interests, or experiences. For example, a project could allow students to explore a certain concept in the course and how it plays out in their own community or culture or field of interest. This way, the assessment becomes a process of meaning making to help students see not just what they've learned, but actually why it matters and how it relates to their life. The third idea is about collaboration and agency. Instead of thinking assessment as something that happens to students, it becomes something we design. This is about creating dialogues. It shifts from assessment of learning as a final judgment to an assessment for and as a learning. So an ongoing process. A lot of you mentioned before that, for example, you do some feedback sessions during the year. This is about centering students' voice, co-creating with them. So also sharing ownership and building on each other learning. These are just some possible ideas going beyond standard ways of assessment. Now I would like to give you all the space to discuss together new ways of assessment and exploring both possibilities and challenges. The first question is about the relational aspect. of assessment? How can it become a space for career of recognition that supports students grow as learners and as people? And then, of course, connected to this is the challenge of how can we sustain relational dialogic approaches with grading system focusing on standardization and efficiency.
Well, in Belgium, there are no state exams, so we don't have to prepare our students to go to university to have an exam. So every school organizes its own exams. Every school wants to make a selection of the students, prepare them from university, and have the best results at the end. Though we don't have this goal officially, every school does it from his own. So that's a problem. Me, 20 years ago, I always tried to get a relation with my students, and that was possible because I knew them very well. I had them mostly for 3 or 4 years. So they started at 13, 14 in my class, and I had them till they were 17, 18. So if you have a relation, then it was possible to have other forms of assessment and so on, because you knew what their capacities were after all these years. But I can understand if someone comes in a class at the final year and you're a new teacher and don't know the students, you have to learn what are their capacities, and then you have to test traditionally. And that's what most of the teachers still do, unfortunately. For me, the most important assessment is the formative assessment and the feedback you give the whole year through. And is this objective? No, that's subjective.
Assessment can become more than just to assign grades. It can be a space where students feel supported, evaluated, but it has to focus on growth, not just outcomes. It's not easy to do it because you have to know your students very well. It's very subjective.
Thank you for sharing. I'm wondering if any of you have ever tried to have a conversation, for example, at the end of an exam or even during an exam, a conversation with students to use more metacognitive strategies to actually think of what they have learned, what challenged them, how they can change that in the future, or yeah, whether this, for example, would be for you something feasible or actually not.
Yes, sometimes on a test, not every test, we have to evaluate. They have to evaluate themselves, an assessment of themselves. The questions we are asking are, do you have studied enough? How many hours do you have studied? Which subject is more difficult for you? Was more difficult for you on the test? How can I progress? How can I plan more my work?
Thank you. We can move to the second point. What would it look like if students could express their learning in different ways that reflect their strengths and identity? So moving beyond the standardized tests, for example. And of course, this bringing some tension. How can we balance flexibility with fairness and comparability across different formats?
I don't do this, but I got a colleague who does this, and the kids read a book and they need to write a book report. But they got 10 options to choose from. So you can make a video about it, you can make a podcast about it, you can make a painting about it, and all of those things. And the students can choose which one of those. Mostly they choose what they find fun, what they are good at. And I think that's something here, that they choose their strengths and their identity by giving them a list of options and they can choose from that one. Some subjects are more easy to implement this than others. And I think for physics, it's a little bit tougher to let them make a painting for their favorite telling of Einstein.
Maybe you can give your group of students 3 categories of exercise: the basic exercises, the elementary exercises, and the more advanced one. You can give it to your students, the 3 papers, and they have to choose between it. You can ask which type of exercise can bring you further in your learning process, maybe. So you give them the responsibility to learn and to set them further in their learning process, rather than you as a teacher said you have to do this exercise and this exercise and this exercise. And then maybe the students come to the reflection, oh, that's not so good for me.
I want to share my experience with math. I've never been a good student of math, but I remember having this teacher who was very creative, and he used to make us remember formulas by transforming them into like short, not poems, but short sentences that rhyme. And he also used a lot of context-based learning, because there are some students who need concrete things to measure. You can't just tell them, figure out what X and Y is. So he always would put a situation that would help you better solve the mathematical problem. And that specific teacher marked me.
Interesting. We can move to the next question, which is how might assessment invite students to apply learning to meaningful real-world contexts? And how can we design authentic tasks that remain manageable to assess?
I remember in maths we had a teacher and he was fixing stuff in his house. He went to us and said, "Look, I need some wood to cover all the walls and all the ceilings. I did my math and I need this area, but now I want you guys to check it." I found that quite interesting. It was something that you need from the real world.
Thank you. It's a wonderful example.
Sometimes it's very essential that you explain to students what the knowledge you're transmitting to them is going to be useful for. For instance, this example could inspire a student to become an architect, but allowing them to do something very cognitively demanding as maths, for instance, or studying grammar without seeing what the potential of the knowledge that you have can get you to can be a bit absurd.
I think students are brighter than we think. So we have to try to help them and to give them a chance to help us, because teachers want to do everything themselves. And if you give more autonomy to the students, you will have half the work you're doing now. In the beginning, it will cost extra time and extra challenges, but in the long run, teachers will benefit from giving autonomy to their students. How it must be done, that's the question. I'm trusting it's possible.
Thanks. We arrived at the end of this session. Thank you all and congratulations.